The Torah reading this week is the Parsha of Behaalotcha. It's a very comprehensive Parsha, and to me, it has an important theme related to the title of this class, which is safeguarding your personal dignity. Personal dignity and self-respect are intertwined with each other. And rather than me pontificating, let's look at a section of the Torah, please. And we're going to begin at the end, the last chapter in this Parsha, chapter 12. And it's on page 794 in the Stone Chumash. And if you can follow along in the Chumash, that would be great, because I want to look at the text a bit. And this class is Le'ilui Nishmat Liba Bas Hanan. It's my mother, interestingly enough, today is her yortzeit, and she was born on June 9th. Dates don't line up usually this closely, 107 years ago. So with that in mind, let's learn some Torah. Chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moshe regarding the Isha Kushite, the Cushite woman that he had married. For he had married a Cushite woman. They said, was it only to Moshe that Hashem spoke? Did he not speak to us as well? And Hashem heard. Torah notes, now the man Moshe was exceedingly humble, more than any other person on the face of the earth. Hashem said suddenly to Moshe, to Aaron, and to Miriam, you three go out of the tent of meeting. And the three of them went out. Now this section, which is cryptic like so many Torah sections of the Torah are, is the classical example of speaking Lashon Hara, speaking something which is true, but it's negatively put, and it's not spoken in a way that had a particular purpose. And here we know the consequence was that Miriam was struck ultimately with sarat, with that spiritual malady, which is always associated with speaking ill of others. And in fact, she was sent out of the camp for 7 days to heal, and the Jewish people waited for her to heal. Given that the three people involved are Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, who we always assume are so close to one another, sister and brothers, close in age, who have worked seamlessly together throughout all of us knowing them in the Torah. What's going on here? So just the text itself refers to Moshe's wife, and there are many viewpoints and many nuances here. But let's take a very simple, not simple, but straightforward viewpoint, which is given, I think, in the Sifri. From the time that the Jewish people stood on Mount Sinai, which was a little less than a year before this, Moshe had separated from his wife. Now, if you remember when the revelation at Sinai took place, the instructions were for the entire Jewish people to separate, for husbands and wives to separate for a period of 3 days in preparation for hearing the voice of God directly. And then the Torah is very specific in saying that everyone should return back to their tent, meaning that normal marital relationships should resume. But apparently Moshe from that time on separated from his wife, something that neither Aaron or his sister Miriam were aware of. They became aware of it. And basically, as it's understood here, is, and it's encrypted in the language of the Torah here, because it says in sentence 3, Moshe was exceedingly humble. And the idea being that Aaron and Miriam made a judgment that what Moshe was doing was wrong. He was not being fair to his wife. He wasn't upholding the norm of Jewish living, which does not celebrate people being celibate or separating from their wives for any long period of time. And therefore, they were wondering, what's Moshe doing? Perhaps Moshe's role as the primary prophet of God has gone to his head. Perhaps he's become somewhat, we use the word arrogant in gross terms, because the Torah mentions how humble he was. So their judgment was wrong. And perhaps we need to correct him. And the fact that they were talking about this amongst themselves on such a rarefied environment, and actually right by the tent of meeting, led for an extreme, clear, strong reaction on the part of God, which ended up with Miriam being afflicted. What was wrong? What mistake did Aaron and Miriam make? And this is where I want to get to the crux of how we see ourselves, how we respect ourselves, and what we see in terms of our own personal dignity here. Nerds, in sentence two, it says, was it only to Moshe that Hashem spoke? Did he not speak to us as well? So there was a misjudgment here, a serious misjudgment. Aaron and Miriam were certainly great prophets. They had close relationships with God. They played critical roles in the exodus of Egypt and in the guidance of the Jewish people at the sea. After Moshe sang a song, Miriam led the women in song. The clouds covering the Jewish people were in Aaron's merit, and the well that provided them with water was in Miriam's merit. So clearly, these people were shared a tremendously deep commitment to the mission of leadership of the Jewish people. The misjudgment that Aaron and Miriam made was, we're prophets, Moshe's a prophet. We don't see any need to separate from our spouses. Why should Moshe separate from his spouse? He must be doing something wrong. Perhaps he's even guilty of a touch of arrogance or a touch of holding of himself too much.
No.
That was the discussion that they had between themselves, according to this Sifri. And there's other versions of this as well. What do I want to point out here? We, each of us, look out at the world and we make constant judgments about people in terms of who we respect and who we respect less, judgments about opportunities for ourselves, judgments about the right course of action in conflicts and resolving things. We need to understand, and the Torah here is holding up a mirror to each of us, the great extent to which our judgments of the world stem from our view of ourselves, because that's exactly what took place here. Aaron and his sister Miriam thought, we're prophets, Moshe's a prophet. Why should he act differently than we do? In the end, what God confirms to them is the extreme intimacy between God and Moshe in his level of prophecy, which is unmatched. The Torah is going to tell us at the end, and never before and never since will be a prophet of the magnitude of Moshe. It really required, and we don't have to understand this so much because it's not the norm, and it wasn't true for any other prophets in Jewish history, but it required this extraordinary action on his part to maintain his constant connection to God. His brother and sister, who certainly loved him and who certainly shared a mission with him and who certainly respected him to the nth degree, even they had difficulty calibrating or recalibrating an understanding of the world based on the distinction and difference of their brother Moshe. An amazing thing to think about. What do we get from this? What can we get out of this? The extent to which our limited perceptions of the world, our limited perceptions of ourselves, which is where personal dignity comes in. We sell others short. We even sell ourselves short. This idea of thinking twice or three times. Now, we do have to make judgments. We do have to make decisions. We do have to find our way in the world. We do have to protect ourselves from people who might be dangerous or might be corrupting of us. All that's true. But we have to recognize the limitation of our ability to make these judgments. And therefore, we need to be charitable, as the Pirkei Avot said, be done the kavskos. We need to at least have a bell go off in our mind as we make decisions that perhaps we're underestimating the other person. Perhaps we're overestimating ourselves. Perhaps we're deciding to do something right now which is even harmful to myself. I'm doing something that's harmful to myself because I'm not acting in a manner which truly reflects the greatness within me. The fact that I'm created in the image of God, the fact that God has provided us, the Jewish people, with a Torah to elevate us, and we have become elevated through that Torah. And perhaps behaviors that we see in other people are not dignified enough for us. And I just mentioned something about clothing because the Torah talks about clothing. We know the Kohen Gadol had special clothing. He wore more garments. The regular Kohanim had special garments to wear. In the history of clothing, it was a given that the more distinguished a person is, the more clothing they wear. We see that in the Kohen Gadol having 7 garments, the regular Kohen having 4. We see that in the fact that kings are always wearing robes and extra garments around themselves. When we think of presenting ourselves to the world, we have an interest in being admired by others. And when we look around the world, we say, "Ooh, people seem to admire people who wear cutaway T-shirts and flex their muscles and have marked up their body with tattoos or whatever the common vogue happens to be at that moment." We certainly are interested in capturing the esteem of people around us. But then we have to have this judgment, just like Moshe, just like Aaron and Miriam were required by God to have a certain judgment 1 second. We're talking about Moshe. We're talking about the very person who stood on Mount Sinai when God spoke to the Jewish people, which Aaron did not and which Miriam did not. We're speaking about the person who more than anyone else is charged, as it says in Pirkei Avot, with receiving the Torah from Sinai and transmitting it to the Jewish people. So a lot of our assumptions we make about ourselves, assumptions we make about how we treat one another or how we treat ourselves, these assumptions have to be reconsidered. They have to be reflected upon. They have to be expanded upon with a sense that, yes, Moshe was exceedingly humble. Moshe didn't have any heirs. Moshe didn't in any way project to others the uniqueness of his position in the world because he was a self-effacing person. But by the same token, that doesn't give us an excuse not to treat someone like Moshe with extraordinary respect. And what I would venture to say in today's day and age is we need to think a lot about treating ourselves personally with what would be easily considered extraordinary respect in this day and age in the world in which we live right now. Because it's not common, it's unusual for people to maintain their dignity as creations of God, for people to speak in a manner which reflects the fact that I'm speaking to a fellow human being. We'll get into this a little bit more. I want to look at one other section in the Torah. If you turn to page 782 in the Stone Chumash, here, if you can look at the text, it would be really helpful. It's chapter 10, sentences 9 and 10. And this is actually a mitzvah in the Torah. And it's a mitzvah that honestly I wasn't that aware of until I studied the book of mitzvah education for this week. And here's the way the whole chapter 10 has to do with creating trumpets, something near and dear to my heart. These are not trumpets as we see them. These were straight arrow instruments. They were part of the temple service. They were part of the culture of the Jewish people in the wilderness and during the temple times. And indeed, just in a very current reference, since you'll see it talks about blowing these trumpets at times of war, Rabbi Osher Weiss, who's the major decisor of Jewish law in Israel today, was actually asked by a group of people who said, we would like to fashion silver trumpets along the design, the traditional design that we know from the Torah, because now that the Jewish people are at war, a war has been brought to us, which is the language of the Torah here, since October 7th. Wouldn't it be great for us to fashion these trumpets and reinstate this mitzvah of the Torah? And he said no, so we don't see that happening. Let's read sentences 9 and 10 carefully together. Page 783 in English. When you go to wage war in your land against an enemy who oppresses you, okay? Sounds like our times. You shall sound short blasts of the trumpets, and you shall be recalled before Hashem your God, and you shall be saved from your foes. Now, certainly the Torah is not saying don't bear arms, but this is the spiritual requirement for us to respond with. Sentence 10, interestingly, on a day of your gladness, on your festivals, on your new moons, you shall sound the trumpets over your elevation offerings and over your feast peace offerings, and they shall be a remembrance for you before your God. I am Hashem, your God. Now, I always understood this section as follows, that just like we blow the shofar, which is different than these trumpets, because the shofar is different from these trumpets, so we blow that specifically on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah to evoke God's compassion. I always understood this mitzvah to be the same idea, only using trumpets. We're under attack. We're waging wars being waged against us. We need to go bear arms and defend ourselves. Let's blow something to evoke Hashem's compassion. But then in sentence 10, why are we doing the same thing when we're celebrating our festivals and our day of gladness? How do you use the same instrument, literally, in order to evoke these seemingly opposite moments in time? That's a question I wanted to seek an answer to. And when you look in the Sefer HaChinuch, the book of mitzvah understanding, he says something that surprised me. He said, the fact that it relates to offerings should convince us that offerings in the temple can become unfit to be presented simply by the thought process of the giver or the Kohen who's offering it. For example, if I bring an offering, a Pesach offering, a Passover, and I come to the temple and I say, this is a really nice lamb. I don't think I'm going to finish it tonight. I think I'm going to put away a couple of lamb chops and I'll have them on Chol Moed. You know, Nobody will notice it's a violation of the Torah because the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, has to be consumed completely the evening of Pesach. It can't be carried over even until the morning. But my mere thinking that I'm going to do that makes my offering unfit. So too, if the Kohen says, yeah, I'm slaughtering this offering and I'm supposed to do ABC, but I'm really not going to do that, that also makes an offering unfit. So what the Sefer HaChinuch says is the fact that this mitzvah of blowing trumpets is grounded in the temple service. And he argues it's part and parcel of the temple service every time a communal offering was made, which is a controversial idea. So here's what the Sefer HaChinuch says. Here's how he explains it. As we perform this service of offerings, which we're doing, of course, to draw close to God, to beseech closeness to God, because a person, due to the fact that he is a material being, okay, which in Hebrew is the word chomer, you'll hear that, we're physical, needs much inspiration towards spiritual matters before he can concentrate on them. For man's physical nature, without anything arousing his spirituality remains unmoved as if it is asleep. And nothing awakens the spiritual nature of a person better than music. Interesting idea, and as totally as an aside, the people who put forward all the ideas of evolution, they have a hard time with music because music is not necessary for survival of the fittest. And why is it that universally people appreciate music? We'll leave that to them to worry about. We're not going to worry about that. But we see here is an amazing dynamic in terms of between me and myself. Because I'm a physical being, because I look in the mirror, because if somebody says, "Who are you?" or if I'm meeting someone, they say, "Well, how will I recognize you?" So I don't readily say, "Well, I'm a humble person. I'm very kind." Um, People say, "What are you talking about? I'm not going to see that. I mean, I'm looking for you at the baseball game. I want to know to say hello. You're wearing a red hat or a blue hat. Are you tall or are you short?" Um, you know, we relate to ourselves so overwhelmingly as physical beings. And we can only truly relate to ourselves as spiritual beings, as creations of God, as being capable of bringing an offering before God in the temple by awakening that within ourselves. It doesn't come so natural. The natural sense is for our spirituality to remain asleep. It requires willpower. It requires intent. It requires mindfulness, to use another word. For us to summon the idea when we look in the mirror and we say, do I look presentable or not? It's a real stretch for us to think, well, am I kindly? Am I humble? Am I acting the way I should be? Am I reflecting the fact that I'm created in the image of God or not? We don't often summon such thoughts when we evaluate ourselves. So we have two senses in the Torah here. So when we feel a sense of gladness out of service to Hashem, and we feel ourselves connected to Hashem, we blow these trumpets as a way of further summoning to the surface a spiritual sense of ourselves. And in sentence nine, when we go to war, and when we know it's a question of kill or be killed, who's going to prevail? And war is a brutally physical process. We blow these same trumpets. We remind ourselves God ultimately is the assurance of a Jewish future. And yes, we're taking action here. We're going to war. I'm in my Jeep. I have my assignment. I have my equipment. And it's going to be a situation of kill or be killed, attack and defend and protect. All that's true. But I can't allow this moment to push aside the fact that there's a God in the world who supervises everything and who ultimately sees to it that the Jewish people endure. And that has to be part and parcel of my feeling, of my thinking. It's an amazing thing. I mean, I'll just mention on the side, the New York Times did a feature article about a hostage, and I'm sorry I don't have his name in front of me, who who came from a secular background and who throughout close to 600 days of captivity, 550 days, said a certain psalm, Psalm 20, over and over again because he remembered it, even though he wasn't accustomed to saying psalms. And then when he was released, found out that his mother had been saying the same psalm over and over again in prayer for him to become free. And then when he told the world, I promised God that I would put on tefillin every day for the rest of my life if I make it out. And he talked about other moments of prayer, how his prayers seemed to be answered in spite of the terrible, terrible hardship that he went through. It shows a sense that in the most physically taxing situations, there's a spirituality and a spiritual aspect that can be summoned by the person and brought to the fore. It almost requires pushing aside the physical. And I can imagine just to put ourselves in his head, yes, I'm hungry. I'm asthmatic and it's hard for me to breathe in a tunnel. I haven't been breathed fresh air for weeks and weeks. I get very little food and I'm hungry. But I'm going to say this psalm to beseech God for his help. I'm going to make promises to God so that when I'm rescued, I'll be able to fulfill them. It shows the human capacity that whether it's under war or whether it's in a sincere moment of approaching God in prayer, which is our substitute for the offerings that the Torah is talking about here, we need to stir ourselves. We need to blow trumpets in our own ears, so to speak. And we need to look in the mirror and say, in essence, there's a dignity and a self-respect I have for myself as one of God's children, as being created in the image of God, which is true for every human being. And especially as it says in Pirkei Avot again, and the extraordinary love God showed us, the Jewish people, by giving us the Torah and elevating us and putting us in a position that we could elevate others. All that's true about me. And it can't be assumed. It requires, an imaginary trumpet blowing on it, summoning that sound, awakening ourselves emotionally and spiritually, because otherwise we just see ourselves as physical beings. And I just want to connect these two ideas, the idea that we had about Miriam and Aaron making their error in judging Moshe too much by themselves, and this mitzvah, which is evoking for us the idea of judge yourself with more respect and more admiration than we typically have for ourselves. It's not a matter that I look good today, so I can feel good about myself. My hair didn't come out good. I'm not so happy with myself. It's a question of I'm here as a being able to draw close to Hashem under all conditions, able to look at myself and others not simply through a physical, what you see is what you get lens, but rather understanding that there's spiritual dimensions and there's all kinds of depth and there's all kinds of um, invisible qualities that in truth define us. And I just want to conclude by saying this is why the Haftorah for Parshat Behaalotcha is the same Haftorah we read on Hanukkah by the prophet Zechariah. And it says famously, "O b'chayo b'go b'koach." It's not through might and it's not through strength, but rather it's through ruchi, through my spirit, through my spirituality. It has the great vision of the Kohen of the time being in the Beit HaMikdash and envisioning a lamp, the menorah, with an unending supply of olive oil feeding it so that the light could remain pure and the light could go on, not never extinguished. And to some extent, each of us should stretch and aspire to apply that vision to ourselves. We have an unending supply of pure olive oil that if we tap into it and we connect to it, will enable us also to perpetually give off a light which is pure and clarifying and holy. And we have to protect that as integral to our self-respect and our personal dignity. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any, but I